For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jane Huckabee, and I'm the director of the International Human Rights Clinic here at Duke Law. And it really is my great privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce Klara Skrivankova, who is the head of the Europe program and advocacy coordinator at Anti-Slavery International. And she's giving a talk today entitled Trafficking and the European Refugee Migrant Crisis. The event, just for a little bit of background, the event is really part of an ongoing human rights practitioner series that we host here at the law school that is organised by the International Human Rights Clinic and the Centre for International and Comparative Law. And today's event is also co-sponsored by Duke Human Rights Centre at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Duke Human Rights Centre at the Franklin Humanities Institute, International Law Society, and Human Rights Law Society. And today's event really simply could not be more timely. Tomorrow is the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, and that date, December 2nd, recalls the day in 1949 when, in the aftermath of World War II and in the newly formed UN, we had the very first UN Convention on combating human trafficking. But now, over 65 years later, more people are displaced within their home countries or abroad than at any time since World War II. And in the aftermath of the attacks in Paris, one of the responses we've seen has been a sort of shutting down of borders, an increased focus on border security and control. And in that sort of calculus, in that discussion, the one thing that's totally off the radar of the policy community and government decision makers is the trafficking risks of being a refugee and migrant in the current crisis in Europe. And so with that backdrop, I'm going to hand over to Klara to talk us through some of the patterns, some of the issues that are happening, and then we'll open up to a Q&A from you all as well. So thank you. Thank you, Klara.
Right. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have been asked to speak here, and thanks very much to Professor Huckabee for the invitation and for bringing me over here from London, and also to the other colleagues, Ali and Sarah, for all the arrangements and for making me feel really welcome. It's been a fantastic day and a half now. I work for an organisation called Anti-Slavery International, which is based in London, in the United Kingdom, and we have been around for the past 175 years. And since our foundation in 1839 by the members of the British abolitionist movement, we have been working to change law practice to ensure that slavery is initially legally abolished and then started to work ultimately to eradicate it. And we are still in the phase 2. While slavery is outlawed in most countries in the world, it has transformed from a legal economic system to an illegal business enterprise that generates profits for individuals and corporations as well as for states. Contemporary slavery, which is often described by an umbrella term, modern slavery, is basically a term that encompasses all the various forms: human trafficking, forced labor, servitude, serfdom, and more traditional forms of slavery, such as descent-based slavery that still remains in some part of the world. The International Labour Organization, the ILO, estimates that there are at least 21 million people in forced labor in the world today. Others suggest that the number is even higher. The ILO estimates also that the annual global profits from slavery are $151 billion. And while the estimates about the extent of the problem remain largely inaccurate and imperfect, the lack of reliable data makes it also more difficult to design appropriate interventions. At the same time, it is an undisputed fact that modern slavery is widespread and very lucrative form of human rights abuse. And as Professor Huckabee has already said, on the eve of the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, it seems only appropriate to talk about some of the current challenges. The humanitarian crisis that we have seen unfold on Europe's southern borders this year raises questions about the nexus between human trafficking, smuggling, and economic migration, and also about the collusion between various forms of organized crime and the connivance on the part of some governments. One of the fallouts of this current state of affairs is a complex situation in which definitions created in international law 15 years ago have become harder to apply, and our systems and responses prove ill-equipped to deal with the crisis, to the benefit of organized criminals and entrepreneurial chancers who are quick to make money out of the chaos. This is not helped by media and politicians who, for the most part, make little efforts to use correct terms when describing the situation. I'm not talking about political correctness here. What I'm talking about is the law. Many of the terms that are used interchangeably, such as trafficking and smuggling, or refugees and migrants, are clearly defined in international law. Whether one is a refugee or a migrant makes a huge difference in terms of their rights to protection and the obligations of the states vis-à-vis that individual. The use of erroneous and inappropriate terms can lead to bad and sometimes profoundly damaging responses. In law, smuggling and trafficking are two distinct criminal acts, each of them defined in a separate protocol to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, introduced in Palermo in December 2000. Trafficking in human beings, or trafficking in persons, which is the term that the protocol to suppress, punish, and prosecute trafficking in persons, especially women and children, uses, is both a severe human rights abuse and a serious crime. It involves a process through which an individual is brought into a situation of exploitation from which another person profits either financially or in kind. The protocol defines trafficking of adults as a process involving three stages: the acts, such as recruitment, transfer, and harboring; the means, such as the abuse of a position of vulnerability, coercion, and deception; and the purpose, which is exploitation, and that can take a number of forms, for example, forced labor or sexual exploitation. Smuggling, however, is different. The protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air defines the act as the procurement in order to obtain, directly or indirectly, a financial or other material benefit from illegal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. So, to put it simply, trafficking is a crime against a person, whereas smuggling is a crime against the state. There are further key differences to consider. Aside from the different legal definitions, the purposes of trafficking and smuggling are very different. The purpose of trafficking is exploitation of the individual's sexuality or labor for profit. The purpose of the movement, in cases of smuggling, is just the movement for profit. There is also a difference in terms of the participation or the consent of the individual. In cases of trafficking, the consent for movement may be present, but true consent is extinguished by the forced coercion or deception that the person is being subjected to. In cases of smuggling, the consent for movement is clearly present. There's also a very different relationship between the individual and the exploiter or the facilitator. So when it comes to trafficking, the relationship is really one between a victim of crime and the exploiter. And a long-term relationship extends well beyond the movement phase, although initial facilitator may be a part of the chain. But there is a continuity of the relationship between the victim and the trafficker. When it comes to smuggling, one can think about the relationship more as a sort of a buyer-supplier relationship. It's a short-term relationship which terminates upon completion of the movement. When it comes to smuggling, the major and sole profit is from the process of movement. When it comes to trafficking, the source of profit is the exploitation at the final destination. Another distinguishing factor is violence and intimidation. The characteristics of trafficking are generally ongoing exploitation, violence, and intimidation, and the exploiter maintains the victim in that situation. where there are cases of violence and intimidation in cases of smuggling, it's more incidental to the movement, if present at all. Not everybody who is participating in a smuggling situation is going to be subject to violence or intimidation, whereas everybody who is trafficked will be subject to some sort of violence, be it physical or psychological. When it comes to autonomy or freedom, in cases of trafficking, any freedom is severely compromised. In cases of smuggling, autonomy is not generally severely compromised, except to the extent that it's required for successful facilitation of movement across the borders. And finally, and that's a very important distinction, is the geographical dimension. Trafficking occurs both internally and across international borders. Migrant smuggling must involve the illegal crossing of an international border. So as you can see, there are huge distinctions in the way we define trafficking and smuggling in law. And remember those definitions, because when I'm going to be using these terms, I'm going to be using them in the way I've just defined them. And definitions are really important to distinguish one act from the other. In reality, however, the lines are often blurred and trafficking and smuggling overlap. Traffickers and smugglers have always cooperated, and traffickers have sometimes used the services of smugglers to get people to another country. For example, many of the Vietnamese young men and children who end up exploited in the UK and Ireland in cannabis grow houses have been initially smuggled into Europe. In other instances, what begins as a situation of smuggling turns out to be trafficking, and the migrant is not free to leave at the end as expected. In the past year, we have seen further blurring of the lines, as smugglers are turning into traffickers and vice versa. We have also seen an unprecedented rise in populations vulnerable to trafficking and susceptible to call on the services of smugglers because of the restrictive migration regime. Other, quite different risks arrive when trafficking and smuggling are conflated for purposes that are not necessarily related to advancing human rights and protecting the vulnerable. For example, it has been noted that during the 2015 European Refugee Crisis, senior government leaders and public officials regularly referred to trafficking in relation to situations that appeared to be migrant smuggling. And our director recently commented on that publicly, and I quote now, "The conflation of smuggling and trafficking conveniently obfuscates the issue and buys political breathing space. It is a classic public relations move by those faced with evidence of their complicity in human rights abuses, or in this case, arguably a preventable atrocity. When faced with such horror, it is easier to make grand statements blaming migrant deaths on the evil of traffickers than to seek the causes and identify proper responses." Indeed, identifying a situation as one of trafficking can be also used to give political legitimacy to responses that may be politically unpalatable if directed against facilitators of irregular migration, especially when those involved are refugees with a valid claim to seek and receive international protection. For example, the language of trafficking and slave traders may be used to justify military action against smugglers and their vessels. But before I go on to explore the responses, let's go over a few more definitions. First of all, who is a refugee? The 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol protects refugees, and it defines a refugee as a person who is outside of his or her country of nationality or habitual residence and has a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, and they are unable to or unwilling to avail that person of the protection of that country or return there for fear of persecution. And people who fulfill this definition are entitled to the rights and bound by the duties contained in this convention. The protection under this law also provides for the so-called non-refoulement principle, which means that refugees cannot, or those who are seeking protection, cannot be returned against their will to a country where they would be at risk. Other rights include the right not to be expelled, except under certain strictly defined conditions, and the right not to be punished for illegal entry into the territory of a contracting state. And that's a very important one in the context of the current debate. So that's the definition of a refugee. Migrants. Migrants are those who have left their country of origin, generally in search for a better life or economic improvement. This term covers international students, and I'm sure there's quite a few of you in the room today. The six-figure salaried bank executive who moves to another region because of a more attractive pay package, as well as the undocumented cleaner that works very long hours for very little pay. Unlike refugees, migrants still enjoy the protection of their own country, even if abroad. And while migrants are not covered by the rights of the 1951 Convention, they still have rights that the states have to protect and respect, regardless of the immigration status of a migrant. And these include ones that are spelled out in Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which prohibits slavery and forced labor. Now, asylum seeker. Who is an asylum seeker? Asylum seeker is someone who says she or he is a refugee, but whose claim has not been definitively evaluated by the state where they applied for asylum. In the European Union, the asylum policy is governed by the so-called Dublin regulation. And each member state is responsible for following that regulation, but at the same time, countries have their own systems for processing asylum applications, the effectiveness of which, of course, differs greatly. Finally, a trafficked person is someone who has been a victim of the crime of trafficking that I have defined earlier, and who is either in a situation of exploitation or is en route to being exploited. Unlike refugees or asylum seekers, victims of trafficking are not defined as a legal category, and being a victim of trafficking doesn't generally provide that person with a status in law in the same way as the status of refugee would. However, international and national law places obligations on states to provide victims of trafficking with some, at least temporary, protection and assistance. For example, the EU law sets minimum standards for protection and assistance to victims. At the same time, it places obligation on the states to identify victims and investigate the crime. Furthermore, the EU and other European states, such as Turkey, are bound by the Council of Europe Trafficking Convention to prevent trafficking by tackling its root causes, reducing people's vulnerability, and also through creating legal migration channels. In the context of the current crisis, prevention of trafficking is where states need to focus, as the number of people at risk of trafficking already in Europe and those trying to reach here are at an all-time high. The current humanitarian crisis began to culminate in November 2014. And the UNHCR, IOM, and other UN agencies estimate that in 2014, some 42,500 people were displaced each day around the world. While the ongoing war in Syria tends to be quoted as the main source of people on the move, many come from other countries and regions that are unstable and where many face persecution, like Iran, Afghanistan, or Eritrea. Since the beginning of the year, unprecedented numbers of people have arrived in Europe. And why, you may ask, did the crisis culminate this year? There are several reasons for that, including the lack of funding for UNHCR refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, which are also reaching their capacity. Lebanon and Turkey alone house the largest refugee population in the world. Second reason is the consolidation of power of Daesh, or also known as ISIL, in parts of Syria and elsewhere, forcing people to flee violence that they use. Also, in November 2014, the Italian government seized the Mare Nostrum maritime search and rescue operation, despite warnings from aid organizations that this could lead to death of migrants and rise of new trafficking and smuggling routes. In April 2015, 800 people died in a boat trying to reach the shores of Italy, and since then we have seen more and more people die on that journey. Another reason that keeps increasingly coming up is also the activities of smugglers. A number of media outlets, including the Time magazine in October 2015, published interviews with migrants who claim to have been actively approached by smugglers with offers to get them across to Europe. Europe has been in division over its approach to managing the amount of people that come to its shores. In September 2015, a picture of a 3-year-old Aylan who drowned crossing the sea and whose lifeless body was washed up on the shore appeared in the world's media. Following the international outrage, most EU countries agreed to relocate 250,000 refugees, but several have still voted against the plan, unmoved by the public outrage. So while Germany welcomed large numbers of refugees, other countries, like Hungary, responded by building fences, even though the refugees only sought passage through the country. The International Organization for Migration estimates that some 750,000 refugees and migrants arrived to Europe this year. This is the highest number since the Second World War, and it has become apparent that the current systems for migration management in Europe cannot cope with the steady influx. It also appears that smugglers have taken over, and some would even go as far as to say that smugglers are now managing the EU's migration policy, not the policymakers or member states. Europe's current migration policy is built along the corridors of movement, and that's what it's called in the EU jargon, and predicted modes of travel. But these concepts appear redundant in the context where routes are changing daily in reaction to measures taken by states, and when refugees and migrants move together. Refugees fleeing conflict mix with those that flee individual persecution and discrimination, and also with those who migrate to escape poverty or in search of a better life. Mixed migration flow is the term that is used to describe such situation. But this notion is far from capturing accurately the complexity and the volume that prove our systems dysfunctional and unable to cope. Against this backdrop, the assessment of risk that those on the move are facing is limited, and in fact, it is the refugees and migrants that are increasingly perceived as a threat to security and integrity of our borders. Yet, human trafficking is one of the known risks that people on the move face, and this ought to be considered, not the least because the EU member states are obliged under international law to prevent trafficking and protect those who are at risk of being exploited. However, assessment of the trafficking risk to refugees and migrants is largely absent from the current debates in Europe. It has long been known, though, that refugees and asylum seekers have been targeted by human traffickers. Those who are forced to move because of conflict or persecution are pushed by a desperate need for income to finance the continuation of their journey, need to repay the debt they owe to the smugglers, and need to support their families. These people make ideal victims. About 12 years ago, I did research in reception centers for asylum seekers in the Czech Republic. We found that the centers were regularly targeted by traffickers. I also know of similar situations in the UK. Informal camps, too, are targeted by traffickers. For example, I gave evidence in a couple of cases in which women were directly recruited from camps, both formal and informal. In the first case, a young Iraqi woman was trafficked by the friends of her brother from an informal camp in French Calais into the UK for sexual exploitation. In the other case, a Ugandan woman was trafficked from a former refugee camp by one of the security guards and sold into prostitution in the UK. These cases happened well before the current crisis, but illustrate really well the kinds of risks that people on the move face. And the question we need to ask is how do we mitigate the increased risk of trafficking in the current context? And also, how do we address the smuggling and trafficking dynamic? Despite the growing awareness that the scale and seriousness of exploitation and facilitated migration, the international response to migrant smuggling has been inconsistent. While new international rules around migrant smuggling acknowledge the possibility of harm and the need to preserve human rights of migrants, This has done little to dispel the widespread perception that smuggling is a crime against the state and that smuggled migrants are complicit in their own misfortune and thereby not victims deserving protection. As I've mentioned earlier, protections that should, in theory, be available to smuggled migrants who have suffered exploitation, including those provided under human trafficking laws, are rarely acknowledged or applied. The number of people who want or are forced to move show no signs of slowing and will most probably increase, at least over the short to medium term. Most of this migration will be facilitated by smugglers, and based on current trend, it is likely that the blurring of lines between trafficking and smuggling will continue. Under these circumstances, it is essential that the international community and the concerned states work to ameliorate the greatest harms and injustices caused by exploitation in migration. For example, much more could and should be done on the broader issue of migrants' rights. States that reap incalculable benefits of low-cost migrant labor that generate the demand being met by migrants should not be able to get away so easily with defending and maintaining a system that deprives them of even most basic legal and social protections. But because of pressures of public opinion and budgets, states are increasingly moving beyond the criminalization of smuggling to criminalization of the act of being smuggled, that is, the migrants themselves. This stands in a stark contrast to persons identified as having been trafficked, who under national and international laws are entitled, at least in theory, to a raft of rights related to protection and assistance. As smuggling becomes the new normal in irregular migration, there is a growing evidence that smugglers are increasingly taking on the role of traffickers, and I've already given you some of the examples from the past. So what they do is they use their clients for extortion, compel them into a situation of sexual enslavement, sell them for forced labor. And even when they have paid off their smugglers, migrants can remain in debt to those who funded their trip, making them highly vulnerable to exploitation in the country of destination. So, what we are seeing is that an increasing number of smuggled migrants are ending up in situations of trafficking-related exploitation. And for all smuggled migrants, the clandestine nature of their journey, the sometimes unscrupulous and corrupt conduct of their facilitators and collaborators, and most critically, the extent to which some states will go to prevent their departure, transit, or arrival, will operate to create serious risks to personal security and well-being. And in such cases, the maintenance of distinction between those who are treated as commodities and exploited and harmed incidentally, the smuggled migrants, and those who are deliberately subjected to exploitation and harm, trafficked persons, begins to look increasingly unrealistic. And the blurring of lines between smuggling and trafficking creates significant implication for states and the individuals concerned. Precisely because smuggled migrants are not considered generally under international law victims of crime, with the exception of one piece of European legislation. But let me now give you some examples of the kinds of situations that we are hearing more and more about. In October, the police put up notices around Berlin in Germany, searching for a missing 4-year-old Syrian boy. The little Mohammed was seen leaving one of the reception centers accompanied by a white European man. Scenarios like these carry the possible hallmarks of trafficking. Just last week, I was speaking at a conference in Switzerland where I learned about a new issue from my Austrian colleagues. Apparently, children are being sold in southern Europe to refugees and migrants to help them pose as a family and thus increase their chances to be treated as a priority or win more sympathy from the authorities in certain countries. Once this has been achieved, these children are left behind and abandoned as they would otherwise pose a burden. They are left alone, unaccompanied, and vulnerable to further abuse. What drives someone fleeing conflict who has often left their children behind in the hope that they can bring them into a safer place later, to buy and use another person's child and use it for better access to the preferred destination? It is very difficult to fathom the despair in the context of crisis, and people in desperate situations sometimes resort to desperate measures. And while it may be easy just to condemn this sort of behavior, we should not forget that this is also a consequence of government policies that put more emphasis on border security than on the rights of humans. It is impossible to obtain precise information, but it appears that only few, if any, of the hundreds of thousands of smuggled persons who have entered Europe this year have been screened for trafficking. Unfortunately, even credible allegation of trafficking of smuggled migrants, like in the case of a young Vietnamese man trafficked for forced labor after being smuggled into the UK, that I mentioned earlier, these cases or these allegations rarely translate into application of different standards or result in a treatment of the migrant as a victim of crime rather than an illegal entrant. So what is the solution for this situation? How can we ensure that the rights of those on the move are respected and protected, and that they receive protection under international law, be it as a potential victim of trafficking, victims of abusive smugglers, or because of persecution? Well, firstly, it is imperative that governments, and not just governments, but in partnership with non-governmental organizations and other experts, conduct a proper analysis of what is happening and also use accurate language to describe that situation. Trafficking and smuggling are not synonymous, and while they sometimes overlap, they are defined very differently in law. We should also take care to understand that those who are reaching Europe are for the most part refugees, but that there are also migrants. But even those who do not fall under the Refugee Convention definition and who are fleeing economic hardship have rights, including the right to be protected from trafficking and exploitation, and ought to be treated with dignity. International action against trafficking in persons provides perhaps the most valuable opportunity to redress the current gaps. While not all exploitation directed at migrants can be rightly characterized as trafficking, a great deal of debt bondage, forced labor, and abuse of migrants that has been documented over the recent years does indeed reach the required threshold of seriousness. And there are tools now available to deal with trafficking in persons, and they include strong international and national legal frameworks, dedicated criminal justice institutions, oversight and reporting mechanisms, and vigorous civil society. And these must all be directed towards exposing exploitation in migration and securing a stronger, more effective response. Thirdly, European governments have to urgently rethink their approach to immigration and reform their systems of migration management, as the extant systems are ill-equipped to deal with the current situation and are, in fact, on the brink of a collapse. Even prior to this year's crisis, states faced a lot of criticism for the failure to create sufficient legal migration channels. And legal migration channels are, in fact, a recognized mechanism to prevent human trafficking and a measure that states are obliged to implement under European law. Another of my final points is that knee-jerk reactions to crises, compounded with the rising right-wing populist politics across Europe, are likely to make things only worse. Anti-immigrant sentiments divide communities and threaten cohesion within a society. And the success of multiculturalism in some European cities, built over a long period of time, can be very quickly destroyed. And while Europe argues over its approach towards refugees and migrants that keep arriving, traffickers and smugglers offer hope and solutions for a payment are the ones who benefit hugely from the current situation. Furthermore, funding needs to be invested into solutions that reduce vulnerability and empower migrants and refugees to protect their rights. And while funding to UNHCR is being reduced, there is no shortage of resources for building of fences, deploying of armies, and to pay often corrupt governments of countries who promise to help stem the flow of people leaving their countries, and to speed up the return of those whose asylum applications in Europe have been refused. You might have seen in the news that in November 2015, 60 European and African leaders met in Malta to discuss the current situation. The key EU came with what some media described a mixed bag of sticks and carrots, including a €8 billion trust fund in an attempt to cajole African governments into taking migrants back and stopping them from coming to Europe in the first place. The Guardian, a major British newspaper, reported that many of the African leaders were disenchanted at an EU containment strategy and pointed out that the EU should stop building Fortress Europe and open more options for safe legal migration channels. And safe legal migration channels are one of the ways to disrupt the otherwise very lucrative business of traffickers and smugglers. Traffickers who promise people a good job abroad, but actually bring them into a situation of bondage. And smugglers who come with the promise of getting people across the borders in a clandestine way, but might actually end up abusing people along the way or leave them stranded at sea. It's well known that if workers are able to migrate freely without the need of an agent or a facilitator, they are at a lesser risk of exploitation. Depending on others to realize one's migration project creates an unequal relationship, a situation of vulnerability that can be easily abused, including for forced labor. I have seen this happen many times in cases of labor brokers that charge workers extortionate fees to facilitate, for example, job as a domestic worker in a private household in another country, and put through those extortionate fees the worker into a situation of debt bondage. And this makes it very difficult for the worker to leave an abusive employer on whom they usually also depend for their visa. Because if the debt is not paid, their families at home would be at risk of reprisals from the labor broker. The conflicts that fuel the current situation and for which the West has their share of responsibility are unlikely to end anytime soon. Europe needs to find a solution for this humanitarian crisis and needs to find it so urgently. It also needs to be a sophisticated one, a true solution rather than putting a plaster on a severed arm. And it also shouldn't be an action designed solely to score political points. A fundamental basis for any such solution is a paradigm shift. Europe needs to move away from seeing the people on the move as a problem and a threat to seeing them as rights holders entitled to protection. States will need to start examining the abuse and exploitation that a person might have suffered, rather than focus on the way they have arrived to Europe. They need to do that in order to determine whether they are a victim of human trafficking or an exploited, smuggled migrant. Furthermore, the tackling of the underlying issues, the conflicts, the instability, poverty, discrimination, and the activities of organized criminals that appeal to people's dreams and hopes and offer a way out of desperation where the states fail, all these will need to come to the center of any solution. In many ways, what it means is that EU ought to go back to its stated principles and values that include respect for human dignity, liberty, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights, pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, and solidarity, and be led by these when designing strategies how to deal with the existing situation and in reforming its migration management systems. Finally, in the meantime, governments and those of us who work in the anti-trafficking field need to be prepared, as we are likely to start seeing more and more of those who started out their journeys with the help of smugglers but found themselves trafficked and exploited. Thank you.
Prerogative just yet. I'm going to open up the floor and please say your name and then follow up with your question.
Hi, thanks so much for that summary. It's and especially laying out those definitions, because I think it's a really good reminder to everyone to keep tabs on that. What do you think is the role of biometrics in managing migration, especially the crisis in Europe?
And Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
And I'm Sarah Katsanis at Duke Science and Society.
Yeah, I think let's take a couple.
Hi, I'm Elise Young. I'm a law student here at Duke. I was wondering how you see the recent tragedies in Paris as impacting the political capital across Europe to increase the avenues of legal migration for migrants and refugees abroad.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm an international student at Human Rights Law. I was wondering how you would respond to the government's claims of funding restrictions and the acceptance of new refugees and migrants.
Sorry, the funding restrictions mean they can't accept new refugees and migrants. Yeah. Okay, we'll begin with those three, and then we'll take a second round.
Right. The role of biometrics. Interesting. If used in a proper way, they can help. But more often than not, I've actually seen them used in a way that doesn't promote in any way the rights of victims. Just to give you a very specific example. A lot of visas, if you apply for a visa, a lot of visas now have to have biometric data, not just of the applicant, but also of somebody who is sponsoring the visa. And so that's one. Also, all asylum seekers in Europe are giving biometric data. So what very often happens is if somebody is trafficked and then applies for asylum in one country and then goes to another country, they're swiftly returned to the first country, which can be very risky for them because you have victims of trafficking that are fleeing from, let's say, Italy to the UK because they're afraid of the traffickers in Italy. And through the biometric system, UK can say, well, but actually you shouldn't be here. It should be a problem for Italy to deal with you and send people very quickly back. On the other hand, the information that states could have about possible traffickers is very rarely used because the focus is on the migrant or on the trafficked person themselves. So, to dismantle their story and to pick hole in their story rather than actually say, well, we know who brought them initially. And if we were to compare the data of that person with data attached to another visa, you can actually sometimes find a trafficking pattern. But very often that's not the case. So in a way, biometrics can be very useful in identifying traffickers and trafficking situations, but very rarely used. So I'm a bit reticent to say that we should make more use of that because so far I haven't seen it used in a very appropriate way. The question about the recent tragedies, I think we have already seen another sort of knee-jerk reaction, and that actually goes completely against the evidence that actually the threat, more often than not, is not coming from the outside, but it's already in the inside. But there is so much reporting and so much abuse of some of these situations to actually put on even more restrictive migration regimes that I'm afraid that this is exactly what the reaction will be. And if you have seen some of the comments of people on the internet immediately in the aftermath, that very much shows a lot of the public opinion to which the politicians are then reacting. And, it wouldn't be the first time that borders and walls are being put up even higher as a reaction to a tragedy without actually looking for a sophisticated solution. So I'm afraid, and we are already seeing indicators of that this is unfortunately not going to make the situation any better and probably going to result in building of more fences. Funding restrictions. Well, it's difficult for one country to cope. Even countries that are quite rich, like Germany, resources are not unlimited. And that's why there has been so many discussions in the EU about quota and accepting a fair share of responsibility, which again, the basic principle of the EU is sharing and solidarity. But that's not going to work because you've got different camps in the EU and countries who absolutely will not take anyone. So it is it is difficult, and again, there is no solution for that. But the question is, what should we be investing into, and what funding is available there? And it's interesting to see, for example, the fact that huge amounts of money have been offered to African countries to basically stop people from coming. And many of these countries have a very poor record when it comes to rule of law and high levels of corruption. So, we can be certain that a lot of this money will not be used in an appropriate ways, and our governments know that, yet it is an easy solution that can be demonstrated to voters, and that's essentially what a lot of this debate is about.
Professor Domchik.
Yeah, so I guess I had a question. You mentioned a couple times about safe legal migration channels. But in relation to that, there hasn't been much discussion about stopping the boats and the the EU aviation policy. That basically any effort to be able to apply for visas or apply for asylum in European embassies or consulates in Turkey, in Lebanon, elsewhere. I mean, that would help to stop the smuggling routes, the intermediaries. So I don't know if there's been any talk of along that route. And then again, I guess maybe less of a question, more of a comment, but just, there's been so much attention on the knee-jerk reaction in the wake of the Paris attacks from the West and the US. But also what's I think is more worrying is that countries in the Middle East have used that as well. So Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey are all using that security guise to close borders, to trap people even further within Syria, and what might be, the trafficking implications there.
You mentioned that the EU needs to rethink a legal framework to address the problem of immigration. Do you think it would be of any help to help these people in their countries rather than helping them in ours? Not by giving them money, and of course.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm an LLM student from Italy, so I'm very affected.
Hi, I'm Coram, an LLM student from France. We keep on focusing on the European Union concerning the refugee crisis. Don't you think that there should be an international responsibility for what's going on, such as that the US should also take on at least as much refugee as the EU should?
We'll do those three,
Yeah,
and we'll go back in for a round three as well.
Well, yeah, you're right in terms of the European aviation policy and the inability to actually apply for asylum through embassies. It's a huge problem, but it's not something that's in any way discussed as a possibility, or I've not heard about that, and obviously I'm not privy to a lot of these discussions because my focus is mainly on trafficking rather than migration. But the fact that people are resorting to other routes is a testament to the fact that no other possibilities are available. And if you look at the migration policies, the labour migration policies that pretty much all European Union countries have, is if you are a highly skilled worker, you have quite a good chance. If you get a job, you have quite a good chance of getting a work visa. If you are a low-skilled migrant, despite the fact that there is a huge labor shortage in some of the low-skilled jobs or low-paid jobs, quotas are full. It's impossible to get a visa. If you manage to get a visa, for example, we see it in the UK quite a lot. There is a very small number of visas that are given to, for example, chefs for particular restaurants, particularly sort of specifically run for particular communities. And that is hugely abused to bring people into a situation of exploitation, because that's the only way how people can come in. So all sorts of agents operate that system. People then end up being exploited. They are not working as chefs. They are working as whatever. And they have no way out. And if they get out, they are immediately deported. So that's a very clear, very, very, very clear example that even if you manage to get in through a legal route, because of the restriction of those legal migration channels, you are at a huge risk. And it makes much more sense to pay a smuggler from a perspective of somebody who really needs to leave. And thank you for the comment about the closing of borders or closing people inside of borders. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the examples. And we've also seen it very skillfully used by some of the countries in Central Asia to sort of position themselves. Many of them position themselves sort of between Russia and the West, and basically, offer their assistance in the fight against international terrorism, and receive quite a lot of funding from the West, including the US, and a lot of their funding is then used to actually suppress their own countries and citizens and civil society. Helping people in their own countries, well, theoretically, that's what the sustainable goals are there for. The idea of actually using the development framework to address some of the underlying issues, which include underlying issues of slavery as well as the reasons for which people migrate. But you can only do that if, A, the resources are available, but also the circumstances in the countries are such that you can actually do it. And a lot of the places we are talking about is you can't. You can't help people in their own countries because they are not safe in their own countries. And that creates a question, what are you going to do? And, the discussions around and the position of the UK government is, well, we will relocate refugees, but we will go directly to Syria and pick and choose who we want. That's an approach that really isn't sustainable. But that's the sort of thinking. That's the sort of thinking around that. The point about international responsibility, absolutely. I think there is. If you look at the underlying causes, including the involvement of the world powers in inciting conflicts in the region, absolutely there should be a responsibility. And I think it's absolutely shocking to hear the numbers that the US is actually considering, compared with the numbers that, for example, Germany have already accepted. So absolutely there should be international responsibility. But again, it's a question of politics and also public opinion. And I think you are in a situation when having presidential candidates debating, and this has become a topic, and it's no longer about trying to find a solution for the situation for the people on the move. It's about scoring political points, and it's about getting higher popularity in the debate.
Sarah.
All right, just building off of that, do you have an opinion or an insight on the Arab region's more wealthier countries to accept migrants and refugees, the reluctance to do so? So do you have an opinion on the Arab region's more stable and wealthier countries such as Qatar, the UAE, to an extent Bahrain, to accept Arab refugees?
Okay, I'm going to add in a question then for you to consider as well. It really struck me when you were talking about how governments are pointing to trafficking and often calling something that is smuggling trafficking as a pretext for much more punitive action. Yet at the same time, they're not doing any trafficking screening processes or counting the victims that may be trafficked within the current crisis. What trafficking screening is happening, if at all? And how can we get a better sense of the numbers? I mean, so I know, for example, that the IOM recently estimated that 80% of women coming from Nigeria to Italy this year have been trafficked. How do we get a better grasp on that? You mentioned at the very beginning that the lack of reliable data has really meant that we can't form an appropriate intervention. So it's a lot of things in there, but why isn't the screening happening? How can we get better data? And secondly, I was really struck by actually the very first time I've heard publicly talked about this. As you know, it was a big shock to hear about the phenomena of children being sold, as to migrants and refugees. And as you mentioned, that brings up so many complicated issues around vulnerability and both of the people who are buying and of the selling to. What does the solution look like to that? That's a new thing. And I'm imagining Sarah's point about DNA testing becomes very relevant in that context too. And so that's a huge phenomenon you just pointed to, and something that can be, I think, the risk of that backfiring as well for refugees and migrants is really huge.
Wow. Okay. Easy questions. Well, if you look at, while I think international responsibility is something that needs to be considered, and more countries need to be prepared to provide sanctuary for refugees, I'm a bit hesitant to look at countries like Qatar or UAE, and in particular Qatar, and that's because of their record when it comes to slavery. And that record and the way that migrants have been treated in this country and are treated in this country doesn't give me much faith that actually those who are in need of international protection would get appropriate treatment there. And we don't, and that's my main concern. So I think the sharing of responsibility also needs to mean that we are sharing certain principles and that people will be treated the way they should be treated under international law. And unfortunately, I haven't seen much will from countries, some countries in the Middle East, to deal with situations of exploitation, to actually promote the rights of migrant workers. On the question about trafficking screening, we haven't seen much. And, on one hand, it's quite understandable if you are in a situation of a humanitarian crisis, you focus on the most immediate and urgent need, and you might not have the capacity, but often also skills to actually deal with the situation of trafficking or potential trafficking. And one of the discussions that we have been having with colleagues recently is around indicators. We've got indicators of trafficking, we've got indicators of forced labor, but they are not very well suited to identify risks of trafficking in this context. So we, in a way, need a new, perhaps, diagnostic methodology how to identify potentially risky situations. And I think we will get there, but it is something that nobody has found an answer to yet. Question of children being sold and what's the solution? That's a very difficult one. And perhaps the easiest way how to try to think about it is to compare it to a situation that's different, but similar in that you have a lot of instances of child trafficking where parents are in a way complicit. But what that would mean is that if you were to prosecute all the parents that are complicit in sort of offering their children, very often in the hope of a better life, there will be villages in certain countries where everybody will be in prison, because that's the matter. So that's one thing. We don't really know much about where these children come from and whether they are kidnapped or whether there is what's behind it. But also in terms of looking at the people who actually would then buy these children, again, obviously it's a crime to do that. At the same time, people are in desperate circumstances and they are reacting to a situation where they cannot get proper treatment by the states that actually should see them as somebody in the need of international protection. So it's a very, very difficult question. And if you were to just apply law, I think the question would be very clear. This is a criminal act, this is a criminal act, the law has been broken. But it's not as clear as that. And my worry is that, unfortunately, this is the way that states will choose to solve the problem, because it's very easy to identify a perpetrator and a victim in that context. It's much more difficult to look at the underlying issues, both the activities of the organized criminals that profit from this situation, but also the poor response of states that actually, in the end, put people in a situation of despair.
Well, Klara, on that note, thank you very much for joining us. It was incredibly informative, and I'm sure people may come up afterward and ask you more questions as well. So thank you very much.